Well, welcome to Christian Answers. My name is Pastor Jeff Short. Glad to have you along for today's teaching. Today, I just listened to a sermon by the pastor Andy Stanley of Georgia, around Atlanta, Georgia. And I have to say, I am really amazed that a pastor would preach a sermon like this. You have to understand the context. I'm kind of shocked that he would take this tact and that he would try to defend and justify his decision and the leadership of his church. He's a mega church pastor. He has over 10,000 people involved in church at a number of different church campuses. And he and his leadership team made the decision months ago when the coronavirus, struck the United States, that he was canceling church services for the entire year. Yes, that's right. I mean, I have not heard of anyone, anyplace else, that's taken such a radical decision about church. Here's a pastor of a church saying, we're not even going to think about meeting as a public gathering of believers until the year 2021. So his church is going to be absent from its public gatherings for a little shy of a year if he carries out this program. Now, a lot of churches in the United States closed for 2 or 3 months and then began gradually to open up, small at first, and then now maybe half capacity, and many states are now allowing this to happen. Some areas like Los Angeles, we've heard of the pastor John MacArthur and Grace Community Church, have been battling with the county there in LA County to meet and open their church, and they are going ahead and they're having services in defiance of LA County health regulations because the church and the pastor and the leadership team is convinced that there is no threat of this virus spreading among church people on Sunday morning because, for one, they haven't had a single hospitalization from their church and nobody has died from COVID-19. And the evidence just shows that this virus, whatever it is and whatever it does, is not affecting people who go to church and prohibiting church services to take place. But Andy Stanley now, having made this decision 3, 4, 5 months ago, 6 months ago, to not meet all of this year, is now trying to justify it to his church members because a lot of them naturally are getting very impatient and saying, no, wait a minute, all of the other churches in this country are making efforts to reopen, even big mega churches. Most of them, there are some that are still shut down, like the big popular Willow Creek Community Church. They've gone through so much trouble. They've gone through so many problems lately involving scandals and sexual assault accusations, sexual harassment accusations from pastors and leaders. They've gone through so much in the last few years. I think they're just saying, look, we just don't need another hassle, problem, challenge by anyone for anything. So they're going to comply totally everything that the Illinois governor and the ordinances, they're just going to follow the book the whole way because they don't want any battles. They don't want any fights. They don't want any hassles. They've gone through enough. They want to take the easy way out, and who can blame them? Yet, they are a church, and they are tasked with the duty of discipling church members and Christians and people seeking the Lord, and that isn't taking place other than by tuning in on the internet or tuning in on television, which is no substitute for actual in-person ministry. But that's what they're doing. Now, Andy Stanley is one of those few churches, those few mega churches that are actually saying, well, we're not even going to meet this whole year for the rest of the year. So in this sermon that I listened to, it was entitled, let's see. It's in it it's not in it to win Christianity, politics, and the local church. So the title is Not in It to Win Christianity, Politics, and the Local Church, August 2020. So this was preached last month, August 2020, and Andy Stanley is trying to give a rationale to his church members, to his people, why they're not going to go back to church until next year, no matter what. Okay, so I thought, okay, this should be good because I've scratched my head and I'm thinking, okay, he made this statement, but is he going to go back on it now that we see that the virus is not killing people at the rate that we initially thought? What the estimates were that the United States would suffer some 2 million or more deaths because of the coronavirus. Well, those estimates were totally off. And right now we're hovering over 200,000 deaths that are either related to the coronavirus or people died with the coronavirus. There's also a big problem and question mark as to how these death totals were arrived at. And in fact, the latest CDC figures show that maybe 9,000 were actually people died of COVID-19, not just with COVID-19, but died of the disease itself, the virus itself. So very questionable health statistics. It's almost impossible to totally get an accurate read on it. But what we do know at this point, after 7 months of battling this, is that the death toll is not as high as was estimated, that younger people under 60, even if they get the virus, will not die in 99% of the cases. People over 70, and especially over 80, are at a slightly higher elevated risk of being hospitalized for COVID-19 and dying of it. But even there, as we learn more about how to treat this, there's still a good chance that those who get the virus still will not die. So there's a very, very good statistical basis now for saying that the virus is not this pandemic, epidemic, crisis that it was made out to be in the early stages. Now, in light of that, in light of the fact that churches are now opening up all over the country, some states have no restrictions on church openings. Other churches are at like half capacity or 3/4 of capacity. Others have different rules depending on their situation. Some say you wear a mask when you come into the church, you sit down, and then you can remove your mask and sing and take in the service, and then when you leave, you put your mask back on. Other churches saying, no, the statistics, the numbers actually show that we don't need to do anything like that. Well, Andy Stanley now is in the situation where he and his church are saying, we're not going to meet until the new year of 2021 sometime. So what's he going to say that would somehow justify this to his members? Because he's getting some rumblings with the people, and they're saying, "Hey, we're gonna start going to church. We can't come to your church, so we're gonna start finding another place to worship." Because they're pointing to the Bible. They're saying, Book of Hebrews, do not forsake the fellowshipping of yourself one with another. They're pointing to scripture that says we need to have the public assemblies. The word ecclesia, the word in Greek for church, means called out assembly. So we want to be obedient to God, and we don't see any health reason why we can't go to church, other than now our pastor and leadership team just has decreed we're not meeting until 2021. Some arbitrary choice like that. So Andy Stanley gets up online, digitally, and tries to talk to his people, and he gives a sermon. I don't know if you could actually call it a sermon. It didn't involve exegeting or explaining a passage in Scripture. It didn't involve actually explaining the Bible, and there was no biblical application. It was just a talk, you might say. And here's what he said, and this is his rationale. And I have to say that it's some of the most sloppiest theological thinking that I've ever heard coming from a pastor. It's just so naive and so underdeveloped and so simplistic thinking. Here's what his thinking is. The first point, our culture is highly politicized now. Okay, we all agree. There is a great political divide in our country. It seems like about half of the people are going in this secularized moral relativism, where man is the center of everything. And then the other half, the older half, and some of the more conservative people are still operating under the remnants of a Christian, Judeo-Christian worldview. And so there's still that understanding that God is God and he has the higher law, and that we live under a lawgiver God, and that everything in society needs to give account to God. And man is not autonomous. He can't just do what he wants to do. He can't reinvent marriage. He can't kill babies in the womb. He can't change a person's gender. And a boy can't become a girl, and a girl can't become a boy. And you can't just identify as the opposite sex, and then everyone is supposed to treat you that way. And all these kinds of issues, there's one half that wants to hold to the Judeo-Christian worldview foundation that this country has operated under for the last 250 years or so, roughly, imperfectly, but basically operated under that view. And the other half of our country that wants to move into this secular, humanistic, almost atheistic, godless, materialistic worldview. And there's a highly political battle brewing. And Andy Stanley evidently says he doesn't want to get involved in any of that. He doesn't want to get involved in any of those battles. He doesn't want to politicize the church. And I agree with him. He shouldn't politicize the church, but he has to realize that just because a issue is political, it doesn't mean that there's something that he has to avoid. Because a lot of things are actually moral. There are a few handful of things that are very critically moral that have become politicized. For example, the so-called gay marriage decision of the Supreme Court. That's a moral issue. That's a moral choice that the Supreme Court made that is contrary to God's law. It's contrary to the Bible. It's contrary to the Christian worldview. It's contrary to biblical teaching. And so that issue was a moral issue way before it was a political issue. And Christians are right in objecting to this secular humanistic takeover that's taking our country away from its worldview that it was founded on and moving it into the direction of some atheistic, socialist, utopian state that have all failed when they've been implemented. For example, the Soviet Communist Russian Revolution in 1917 was a failure. We saw the fall of Berlin, fall of Soviet Union. We've seen the atrocities that have come out of communist China. Everywhere this godless, atheistic, humanistic philosophy has gone, it has brought death and destruction. So yeah, there's a political divide in our country, and it's not enough that pastors say, well, we're going to stay out of that politics. It divides people. Well, it does divide, but that kind of division isn't all bad because you do have to make a choice. So he's bothered by everything's over-politicized, and it is over-politicized. And I agree with him if you're talking about debatable issues, secondary things, yeah, there's room for Christians to be on different sides of the issue. If you're talking, for example, about immigration, I can understand if there are two Christians and one wants easy immigration and the other wants strict immigration rules. They can go back and forth and they can debate and they can give reasons for their position. And there actually isn't one answer that's a clear-cut moral answer. And that's one example. So if there are people who want to over-politicize border policy, yeah, I understand his concern about politicizing the church and dividing good Christians. on secondary issues. But that's not what he's just talking about. He's talking about all these political issues. He doesn't want to get involved in any of that. So he says that's one of the reasons why he wants to stay out of politics. Another thing he says is the cancel culture. He says he doesn't want to be a part of the cancel culture. He doesn't think that just because you disagree with someone on one point that you should cancel them. And I don't think that is a problem in the Christian community. But he is facing criticism because of his trying to sit on the fence and be neutral and be above the fray. And he's being legitimately criticized. And so it's not a cancel culture. I don't cancel Andy Stanley. I think he has been used of God and he makes some good points. And much of his material is solid and much of his material is helpful. And he's done some good in his ministry. And I'm not trying to cancel him. I am critical of his approach because he's trying to sort of live in denial that there is a spiritual and moral battle raging right here in this country. And he's trying as best he can to avoid even acknowledging the spiritual battle. He's saying we're not going to get involved in any of that because it's so divisive and it divides people and causes hard feelings and everything. Well, that's what happens when you preach the truth. If you say that marriage is between a man and a woman, and that's the only configuration of marriage, you will be criticized, and you will be misunderstood, and you will cause hard feelings. But that's the price of truth. And Jesus never shied away from preaching the truth, even if it made people mad. So Andy Stanley seems to be worried too much about alienating people and causing division. He just needs to preach the truth. What does it say in the Bible? Preach the word in season and out. Preach the word in season and out. If it's popular, preach it. If it's not popular, preach it. In season, out of season, in between season, whatever. Preach the word. Don't give up preaching the word. So he's really concerned about the over-politicization of this culture. He's really concerned about the cancel culture, and he doesn't want to be a part of that. And finally, he comes to the cultural wars, and he says, we are not going to fight in the cultural wars. And he's very adamant on the fact that he is not going to fight in the culture war because he says it's more about winning than it is anything else. Well, I have to disagree with him. As Christians, we don't have winning as our priority. We have truth as our priority. Okay, it's either true or it's false. Is marriage between a man and a woman as defined by the Bible and the Judeo-Christian tradition, or is it not? And if it is, are you willing to take a stand where you have a voice in society? Andy Stanley tries to go back to the Bible and says, Jesus never fought these cultural wars. The disciples never fought in these cultural wars. How can you fight in a cultural war if you don't have a voice? They were oppressed citizens of the vast Roman Empire. There was no democracy. Their voice didn't count. They didn't get a vote. They didn't go to the polls every 4 years. They couldn't vote in representatives. They couldn't select senators. They couldn't vote on a president every 4 years. They had no say in the government. So what good is it to try to fight in a cultural war if you don't have any voice? It would have been futile. It would have been stupid. It would have been suicide. So, of course, Jesus and the disciples and the early Christians didn't voice their Christian values in a public political sense, in the sense of trying to vote and influence the wider culture in that direct democracy way. No, they didn't, because it would have been futile. It's the same way in the Soviet Union under the communist rule. The pastor didn't go out there on the street corner, and there weren't door-to-door campaigns to try to eliminate some policy of the Soviet Politburo. Why? Because if you did that, they'd throw you in prison camp and ship you off to Siberia, and that's the last they'd hear of you. So it's a totally different context. And Andy Stanley should know that. Jesus and the disciples didn't have a voice in their government. We do. By the grace of God, we have an opportunity to actually make a difference. We have an influence. We have a voice. And so as Christians, we stand up for truth. It's not about winning. It's not about being the king of the hill. He's making it seem like we're all just doing things for self-centered self-interest. We're just one power block. We just have our own self-interest. We want our things our way, and we're going to fight like the pagans do to get our way. We want the king to be the king of the hill and in control of everything. No, we want the truth to prevail in society. And so then we can go back and live our lives in quiet and peacefulness. We don't want to be up here marching and protesting and raising our voices. But when we get an opportunity to vote our Christian values and our biblical values, we take it. And so you can't duck and deny and avoid the cultural wars. The cultural wars have come to us. And so we are in the midst of a cultural war to determine which direction our nation will go into. And so it would be the height of irresponsibility, and I believe that Andy Stanley is acting irresponsibly in trying to duck out of the culture wars and saying, well, our church isn't involved in the culture wars. That is a decision to not stand up for truth. That is a decision to not voice your values and your Christian beliefs in public. And that is a cowardly way of doing things. You have to be willing in a democracy, whether you like it or not, to stand up for what you believe. And so it's not about winning, it's about the truth. If we were a self-interest voting bloc and we only cared about our own concerns, we certainly wouldn't be spending a lot of time voicing our objection to the killing of babies in the womb, abortion. Why? Because it doesn't affect us personally in a daily way. I'm alive. I live and breathe and have life. And how is that a self-interest if I am fighting for the right to life of the unborn babies? It isn't. It's not a self-interest. It's a selfless interest and cause that we fight there. So he's totally wrong in his evaluation of the motivations why people stand up for the truth. Now, if you stand up for the truth, you will be against the party of death. You will be against the cultural side, the Democrats, the leftists, the liberals, the radical socialists are trying to take the nation. You can't avoid that. If you stand for life, you're going to stand against the party of death, the pro-abortion party, the pro-euthanasia party, the pro-infanticide party. You're going to stand against, if you're for the godly one man, one woman marriage, you're going to stand against the party of the perversion of marriage, the Democrats, the liberals, the leftists, the socialists, the radicals. You're going to be against that. And it's not that you want to be in power and control everything for your own benefit. No, it's just you standing on truth. And so he and his church, I guess because he's leading his church, he's decided, well, we're not going to fight. In fact, he actually says, we're going to go the way of Jesus, and that is we're going to actually lose on purpose because we're not even going to fight. We're going to be non-combative. We're going to be non-resistant. We're just going to let the other side win because that's the way of Jesus. He just let himself be captured and taken and put on the cross and killed because we're going to take the way of love. And somehow that's supposed to be a paradigm for Christians' citizenship in a democratic society. It makes no sense. No, it's not at all related. Jesus had a definite mission that he was sent here to accomplish on earth, and that was to die for the sins of the world. That is not a paradigm that you can just take and apply everywhere else. And he says we're going to stay closed all year so that we love our neighbor. We don't want anyone to die of this virus. Well, that would make sense if this virus were killing people in the numbers that we first learned that they might. But it makes no sense after you've looked at the statistics and the data and conclude this virus is not killing people that way, and so there's no need for these drastic measures. And so if you meet, like Grace Community Church out in California, and you meet with thousands of people packed into a church service without masks on, lo and behold, nobody's getting the virus, nobody's going to the hospital, and nobody's dying from the virus. Now, if that's the case, then it's not loving your neighbor to not meet. Actually, it's hurting your neighbor because your neighbor needs to have the salt of the earth in full operation. The community needs the church at full strength. Community benefits from the church operating in the love of Christ and in the power of the Holy Spirit. And you don't get that if you're canceling your church service for the year. So Andy Stanley's logic and thinking is so much muddled on this. And his understanding of following the way of Jesus is all confused. And we are supposed to love our neighbors as ourselves, but we're not supposed to simply follow false data and false information and false policies that are actually hurting society, ruining our nation, weakening our churches, and scattering the flock. No, that's not loving your neighbor. So Andy Stanley attempt at giving some kind of a rationale for his radical and extreme understanding of closing his church the whole year. See, his thinking is there's so much politics and there's so much culture wars and there's so much confusion and there's just so much chaos in society right now. People are afraid and you don't know what information to believe and who to believe. And there's so much swirling about in society. Let's just cancel the whole thing. Let's just not do any of it for the whole year. No, that's not the solution that a pastor gives his flock. And that's not good leadership. And so Andy Stanley, if you're listening to this or someone shows you this, you need to reconsider your extreme and drastic statement about not meeting for the whole year. You need to begin to figure out ways that you can get your flock, your sheep, back together again. That's your responsibility to disciple these people and care for the flock and build up believers and reach out to the unreached. You need to begin to think in terms of going back on what you initially said and getting your church back together, like other churches have concluded. And there's nothing wrong with changing your mind. It just takes a little bit of humility to realize that you got it wrong. Well, I hope that's helped in thinking through that issue, and we'll see you back next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.